we have a lot of events in Israel, despite certain government crackdowns. One of the events is going to be the Wine Festival, which will take place at the Israel Museum, also in Jerusalem as well. So very apropos and to have our guest this evening. You can check him out at themuseumguide.co.il. He is the museum guy, Nachliel Selavan. Welcome to the program.
Hi, I'm good. I actually was looking into purchasing the museumguide.com and I saw it's not available, but I'm Museum Tours COIL, but you Google the museum guide, that actually works, so that's great.
Okay.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yes,
Wow.
we wanted to have you on for a while. Happy it worked out. So we like to have controversial questions and answers on this program.
Ooh.
So I'll start with a real good one. I think you'll like this. I was mentioning to a friend of mine a few weeks ago, I said, to get technical about it, there's more physical evidence that Jesus existed than Moses. So I'll tell you what I mean by that. As a gentleman that grew up in the Old City, the Christians at least claim, they say, we know where this man had his Last Supper, there's the room. We know where his mother was born, there's the room. We know where he dropped the cross on the way to crucifixion, there's the spot, and they made a church, etc. When it comes to Moses, we don't have any physical proof that he existed. In fact, the rabbis even talk about it. They say, the reason why we don't know where Moses is buried is because people would have turned that into like a shrine and an idol worship type of thing. They didn't want that. So I'm sure this comes up a lot in your type of work. You have a yarmulke on your head. Sometimes you find things that don't necessarily support what you believe in. Mm-hmm. How do you reconcile those two and start with that aspect of physical evidence with Jesus, no physical evidence that Moses existed?
Well, I'll start with the Jewish story. There's different types of proof and different types of evidence. If you're looking for something that's material, the chances of you finding anything are very slim for a number of reasons. Number one, nothing was written down in the desert, and number two, following nomads don't leave tracks. So I'll backtrack, there is an archaeologist known as Avner Goren, and Avner Goren wanted to study the travels of Israel in the desert, so he said, let's run a pilot, and he followed nomadic Bedouins in the desert, and he found that after only 2 weeks, you cannot find a trace. So the chances of finding something from 3,300 years ago is impossible. You're not going to find anything. So what exactly are you expecting to find that would prove the existence of a person who left nothing material? So there's a different type of evidence which is ethnographic, which is cultural, which is you have Jewish communities and Israelite communities from around the world who, for the past several thousand years, have been telling the same story. And we're talking about people who go before Ezra. So people say this is all codified after Ezra, but that doesn't really fit with the narrative of, let's say, the Yemenite Jews, right? Or the Jews from Jerba, who were there from before that. And they're holding on to the same story, which is we came out of Egypt, we came into this land, and we had this person who was our leader. So those stories, they come from somewhere, and they're very, very ancient. So that itself is a certain level of evidence. I'm not expecting to find anything concrete, but when it comes to Jesus, we're talking about a Jewish person who lived in the Second Temple period. There are writings about him from after his lifetime. There are some writings which may be attributed to him from the Talmud, from very, very few lines. You can take all of them and fit them on one page. Some were censored, whatever it is. Some in Maimonides are censored, but that's over 1,000 years later. They talk about this person who had an impact. But from the time himself, you're talking about a person who was walking around and preaching. He's not creating anything which you would expect to find. When it comes to the stories of the Via Dolorosa, the path of the suffering, like the bearing of the cross, that itself is only from, let's say, the 3rd or 4th century, where Queen Helen, the mother of Constantine, the Emperor Constantine, starts building churches and creating this commercialization of Christians coming to the land of Israel and basically coming to buildings and saying, I dub thee, the place where. And there's stories of these several crosses that were found, because when Jesus was crucified, there were 2 other people who were crucified. It was standard Roman punishment. There was some sort of thief and something else, or there were 3 crosses that were found. And I'm a bit rusty on the details, and I don't mean rusty nails. I'm a bit rusty on the details, but there's a legend that she has that there was some Jew who knew which was the right one, and they tortured him and made him tell the story. So all of this stuff is also after the fact, but you don't really know anything that he did. You just know the locations where things happened. And And as far as that goes, you have plenty of biblical stories of where things happened, and the question is, can you rely on those stories from a very academic point of view? Can you rely on the story that's being told that he passed in these and these and these places? We came out of the Red Sea, we passed by here, we went there, we went
back
there.
to Moses.
Right, so back to Moses, like he went to these places, you can say, okay, the description, the textual description of the journey fits with what the reality. But you can still argue, yeah, but that was written much later, right? So it's not 100%. So at the end of the day, you have stories. You have a nation whose identity is built around those stories with the hopes that, the story is passed along properly, but we don't really have anything conclusive other than that.
Okay, so the reason why I bring up Moses is that it's very unique in that most Jewish people that have a significant impact in history have a burial place. Even Rabbi Akiva, who didn't even have a body, has a burial place in Tiberia. So if you can contrast that, because for example, you look in Tanakh, Abraham bought a place in Hebron. We go to Hebron, we see it's there. Mm-hmm. It appears that the Arabs have kept it in pretty good condition. There's not a McDonald's there. It hasn't been westernized. And it looks like that this is the place. And then we have the Avot and the Emot, and it appears that they respect those as well, those characters. So is there more evidence in that regard? Because we can see it. We've been there.
In terms of the burial of Moshe specifically?
Well, the fact that for example, if someone says, how do you know Abraham existed? And I say, here's his burial spot. Does that work?
I could argue that I can counter that by playing the devil's advocate and saying all of the traditions of anything that's pre-Second Temple is based on traditions which showed up later. Okay. So what the earliest building that we have in Me'arat HaMachpelah is Herod. Herod built it. That's why it looks so much like the Western Wall. It's the same builder. But what was it built on top of? What do we know about that? We don't really have anything about that other than the tradition that that's where the place is, which he followed. So whatever traditions he had, we have nothing in writing. We have no material evidence. We just have the assumption that whenever Herod built that, we're talking about 2,000 and let's say 30 years ago, there was a tradition that that's where it is. But that's all we have to go on. But when you come of, let's say, the burial of Joseph, the burial of Joshua, the burial of Caleb, the burial of Shimshon, the burial of Dan, sometimes you have even people like Chavakuk or Yonah where there's 5 different places where he may have been buried. Some of them are all over the world. So we don't really know. We have traditions. Some of them go back to the 12th century. Some of them maybe earlier. But you don't really have anything conclusive if you want to be controversial. So you can say, like, listen, we're trusting the oral tradition, but we don't really have evidence. We just have the assumption that, okay, that's what they say it is. That's why it's very much debated. When it comes to well, if you want to talk about the tomb of the Holy Sepulchre, you can say that it's one of those unspoken secrets that everybody knows, is that that's not actually the burial place, right? There's nothing there in the tomb of the Holy Sepulchre. It's somewhere else. And I'm not an expert on Christianity. This is sort of like urban knowledge. It's common knowledge that's not where the burial is. It's just, I dub thee. And that itself also has some power, like King David's tomb. That's Binyamin of Tudela. He's the earliest one to ever mention that. We have no indication before that of that being King David's tomb. In fact, it doesn't even make sense that it's King David's tomb because it's in the wrong location based on the description of where he's buried. It's more likely that it's Kivrei Beit David, which means that's where kings of the royal house of David were buried, but not King David himself, who would have been in the city of David.
Shar Tzion.
Right.
Okay.
Right. And which, by the way, is a misnomer. Mount Zion is actually Mount Moriah. Mount Zion here, it's in the wrong location. It's west of the city. It's outside of Jerusalem of the time. So it doesn't. We have some Second Temple period stuff there that the buildings were stopped after 67. The excavations were stopped after 67. We don't really have anything conclusive. But when it comes to Moshe, you can say, oh, how convenient. You invent a story that's not traceable. But I don't buy that because there's so much description about the culture before that, about the nomadic culture, about even Bilam, who we found archaeological evidence of. And we have the description of Egypt and the fall of a particular dynasty, which you can debate how far back that is. That's not really conclusive. But the description of Egypt is very accurate, of the milieu of Egypt, of the belief system of Egypt, and the impact that the 10 Makot have. You can really go into depth on that. But the idea of Moshe not being known, and this is, I think Ramban brings this, or Nachmanides, is that had his location been known, it would have been turned into a commercial center, just like the tomb of the Holy Sepulchre. It would be commercial, and just like you go to...
Or maybe some rabbi in Ukraine?
who I am distantly related to his star pupil, but I'm not. It's my great uncle is Rabbi Natan, but
Okay.
yeah. But I also come from other Chassidut who are like vehemently anti-Breslov, so I have that dichotomy. So I'm not going in there.
We'll do an episode for the argument that it's good to go. We're going to try to cover all bases possible.
Yeah. Which one? Uman?
Yes.
Oh, I wasn't getting into the details. I'm just like.
Well, the argument's going to be that you see that, let's say that is an incorrect practice to go, you see how a burial place could turn into something such as...
A burial place could become worship.
Yeah.
Right. The same idea as you have with Moshe's greatest achievement, which according to the final Rashi in the Torah, his greatest achievement is the fact that he broke the luchot. The tablets. Why? Because had he not broken them, the golden calf, this idea of golden youth, the golden calf, that thing that they were, that crutch, that dependency, that everyone was dancing around and saying, Harry, I've reached the top, right? They would just replace that with the luchot. So we would be locked into never growing and just celebrating our achievements and being stuck. He shattered the luchot to free us. That is his greatest achievement. That's why it says in Rashi, God says, Yishar kochacha sheshibarta. Yishar koch for breaking these luchot, which you did le'inei kol Yisrael, the last words in the Torah, behold, before the eyes of Israel. That idea, the same thing would have happened to his grave. This is the tomb of Moses, and people would have turned him into an icon and a symbol. And there's a very profound Jewish theme which relates to this period of time, to Tisha B'Av, to the shattering of symbols. We had the temple was an icon, and God said, if you're going to turn the temple into an icon, I will also break that. You must learn not to be dependent on icons. So Moshe Rabbeinu would have been the icon par excellence, and we need to make sure that will never happen so that we can be free.
All right, good. This is the Ari Lewis Show here on IsraelSportsRadio.com, also YouTube channel, The Nation of Israel, not The Nation of Islam. You mentioned Jesus. Let's talk a little bit more about the man, because there are some misnomers in the Talmud, as you mentioned, about this character, because very often he is referred to as Yashka, correct, as that guy, but we don't really know if that is that guy being Jesus, correct?
You're catching me off guard with the intricacies of Christian studies and Jewish texts, which I'm not an expert on. I'm just giving that as a disclaimer.
Okay.
The Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, Talmud Bavli, was written in Babylon under the Sasanian Persian Empire, whose primary religion had nothing to do with Christianity. Christianity did not concern them in any way, shape, or form, so they didn't really write too much about him.
Okay.
So you're not really expecting to see anything, especially when Christianity only really became popular, later on, like in the 4th century, 5th century, the Byzantine Empire. So it wasn't really a concern to the Babylonian Talmud. There are a few passages which can be debatably talking about him, but one of the controversies about him, and this is brought by the Ramban in the famous Tartosa debate,
yes,
is that he lived in the Hasmonean period. That he was a student of Rabbi Shimon ben Shattach. Probably Rabbi Shimon ben Shattach.
Okay.
So he was much earlier than that. I'm not really clear on the details, but the question is, does he even fit, and who was this person? But whoever he wasn't taken too seriously.
At his time.
I have seen some of these very bizarre, so to speak, censored texts which talk about Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva and condemning him to death and all this magic and witchcraft that he did, and they countered him with God's names and did, I've seen flew in the air and peed on him, and I've seen some really weird stuff. I really don't know what to say about it. I don't want to say anything wrong, so I'm just saying I don't know what to say about that. I have heard Hahu Gavra, that person, as referring to him. I don't know the consensus about that. I just know that he wasn't of great concern in the Talmudic text.
Well, let's talk about censored text, because there was obviously a period of time where Jews weren't as free as, even now we're not so free, but we're freer, where we weren't necessarily able to express what we were thinking, and certain things had to be hinted to.
Well, publications.
Publication, yes.
Yeah.
So give us some examples of things that were censored that were uncensored. Now we know what they meant to say at the time, and if they had hints.
Wow. There are some texts in Maimonides which are very famous from his one of his final chapters, Ilchot Melachim u'Milchamotehen, the laws of kings and their wars, which very much relates to the Messiah. So there he has some very famous passages now that have been censored where he talks about Christianity and Islam.
Okay.
Which makes a lot of sense that you'd censor things he says about Islam. He actually says some good things. He says that we owe a lot of a lot of thanks to Islam and Christianity for spreading the concept of monotheism, even though they have a lot of things wrong, but the concept of monotheism itself is novel. It didn't exist other than the Jewish people, who were some small kingdom in Judah, while you had a very large pagan world, and monotheism won. So they have a lot of things wrong, but all we need is Mashiach to come and those small mistakes to be corrected, whereas the big idea is there's one God. So it's possible that the church censored that later because it's saying something in favor of Islam. I'm not sure of the background, but that's a very famous text. Whereas there are also some other things, like we mentioned from the Talmud, which talk about Jesus in some sort of negative way, and that's been censored. Something about him and his followers have no place to the world to come, or things like that. There are texts in Maimonides which talk about what people don't merit in the world to come, and it was changed in the censorship from Christians to something else, like people who disagree with X, Y, and Z. So it's been, neutralized. You have to know that very often there were, like for example, with the burning of the Talmud in 1252, I think, in Paris. I think it's 1252. I might be wrong. That there were actually proselytized Jews who came out against, like I think it was a pope or a very high-ranking minister in Christianity who was a Jew,
right?
And he knew all this stuff,
yeah.
Right? And so they burned the Talmud,
right.
Which is why we don't have entire tractates of there's an entire order of Mishnah of Gemara in the Yerushalmi which we don't have, Yerushalmi and Kachim, which we know existed, but we do not have a copy of. It's likely that that's where it was destroyed because it was all manuscripts. So a lot of things were found by Jews who knew all this stuff, and then they turned to the other side and had it destroyed. So there was also the concern for those kinds of things and battling about the interpretation and what they mean, and so things needed to be changed. And this is even before the printing press. When you get to the printing press, then you have the 14th century. I mean, you have the church basically saying, if you want to print your Tanakh, you're going to have to do it the Christian way, which is, number one, the chapters that we use today are only about 700 years old, right. And also the division of the books, which, for example, 1st and 2nd Samuel, Shmuel Aleph, Shmuel Bet, that's an arbitrary Christian division for convenience sake. It's like the number 22, that's a nice number of chapters, let's break into two. Or 1st and 2nd Kings, or 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Melachim Aleph, Melachim Bet, Divrei Hamim, or Ezra and Nehemiah are one book, right? So those things are Christian, as well as the division into the chapters. It's not just the numbers of the chapters. Very often you have, this isn't censorship, but this is a very good example of where there's an agenda in how the text is going to be presented in the printed press, which is really what made it popular. For example, the 1st and 2nd chapters in Genesis and Bereshit. Chapter 1 is days 1 through 6. End of the story, go home kids, see you next week. Chapter 2, so the Sabbath. It's detached from where it belongs because
the Christians, you're saying, made a separation.
Because Sabbath is Sunday.
Okay.
So we're detaching it from its context. Okay. Right, and there's many examples like that. Sometimes it's just convenience, just memorizing numbers of verses, but sometimes there's an agenda.
Okay, so very interesting. So in regards to, let's say, censorship, what would be something that you noticed affected Jewish practice based on censorship?
I don't know.
I'll give you an example. I'll tell you why I bring
know.
that up. This is an example why I bring it up. We of course have the 10th of Tevet fast day, which is a very serious day. A lot of people don't think it's so serious because it's in the winter, it's like 12 hours, not a big deal. But it's very serious in part because it used to be 3 days, 8th, 9th, and 10th.
Right.
And the 8th was not celebrated.
Well, it's Ezra's death.
And
the translation of the Torah.
Correct. And the 9th, the phrasing is, we fast on this day and we don't know why. There's a theory that it was Jesus' birthday. And I don't mean to insult our Christian fans. We're trying to do
I never heard that one.
Yeah, so this is something I've heard, and that might be an example of censorship because they couldn't have said we're fasting because it's Jesus' birthday, because that would have caused a lot of anti-Semitism. I
mean, when would there have been a fast day commemorating his birth? It just sounds so awkward.
Well, the 9th of Tevet is close to December 25th.
Yeah, it's close.
That's a theory,
I hear. I'm just like, why would it be so important that his death is a big deal? It's interesting. You caught my attention.
So this lecture I heard a couple years ago. That's interesting because when you have censorship, sometimes it's hard to kind of put the pieces together and figure out maybe they meant this, maybe they meant that. But certainly there were times, especially when under Roman persecution and Greek persecution, etc., we couldn't necessarily say that out loud.
Right. Things were changed. Like, I mean, the Siddur, we say "Laminim lamalshinim al tehi tikva," which means those people who are slandering against us, or the minim, basically people who are out of the fold, may they not have any hope, and may God for other in the daily prayer in the Amidah, in the Shemona Esrei. But the original text is "Lameshumadim al tehi tikva," and Meshumadim is a specific reference to Jews who became Christian. Meshumadim. Actually, what's really funny is I saw a siddur, a manuscript from Kaifeng in the new Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., and it was open up to that page, which is a Christian museum, and it says, La Mishumadim al Tikva. It was just open to that page. Coincidence? I don't know. It's really cool.
I feel like nowadays that there's a lot of good Christian friends are very much into the Bible, and they will be honest. They'll say that there's censorship that took place. They want to figure out the truth. They're trying to put pieces together, too.
I mean, censorship of not of the Tanakh. The Tanakh, there were deliberate editings of changing of words to fit in with the Christian gospel, which I only knew this because I followed some videos by Tuvia Singer, but he's the expert on this stuff. But I've seen like concrete examples.
Yeah, I'll give you a classic one. So I was 17 years old, I'm walking home from school. I see 3 guys on a bike, and I'm thinking, I'm going to get jumped. But instead it was Mormon missionaries. So they're trying to convince me to join the Mormon church. And Mormon are very nice people. I grew up in Arizona, very nice people. And
this is in Israel or here?
No, Arizona.
Oh, Arizona. You said that.
A lot of nice people. Now, Mormons, very fascinating. They call non-Mormons Gentiles. There's a lot of similarities with Judaism, actually. Very nice people. So one of the things they pointed out is that, there's a prophecy that says a virgin birth. I'm like, is that right? And then I look it up.
And it's like
young maiden birth.
Yeah, alma, that's the word, alma.
So is this an example you're talking about where things have changed, trying to
yes, that's one. Another one, I met a very interesting person. You may have heard of the story Guma Agiar. He was a convert, but his family was like Jewish, and he discovered he was Jewish, but they thought he grew up Christian. There's a whole story. He was a very interesting, controversial character.
Yeah.
And I think it was his brother-in-law, so I met him. My father had some kind of connection with him. I met his brother-in-law, and he said, yes, I'm learning Hebrew, and the word that he knew was ka'ari, which means like a lion, which is like the most random word to know. And he said, but that's because that's from the Psalm, Tehillim Chavbet, Psalms 22, Eli, Eli, lama azavtani, my Lord, why have you forsaken me? Which Christianity then puts, I think, in another one of the Christian books, Lama shevaktani, why have you forsaken me? Which is the words Jesus said on the cross. But those words are said there, Eli, Eli, lama azavtani, and one of the verses there is Ka'ari yadai v'raglai. It's like I'm surrounded by a lion and a dog and etc. like that, but they changed the word like a lion to say you crucified my hands. So the word ka'ari is the actual word, which does not exist in the translation. I think it's the King James Bible. So he never knew it. So once he saw the Hebrew, he's like, wait a minute, that's not the translation. So it's like that same experience. You go, what? Doesn't say that.
Right.
It says like a lion.
And I happen to bring this up because there's a lot of firm Jews out there who I don't know why, but they don't really study the prophets. I don't know where that comes from. But what happens is very often some verses can be manipulated. Like it's because Tanakh, it's very poetic in a lot of places. So there's some spots where it'll say, like Isaiah 3, he is in chains, he is suffering for sins, etc. And a lot of missionaries will say, well, isn't that Jesus? But we would say he refers to Israel in that case.
Well, the general approach to that, which I've heard, again, from Tuvia Singer, is just ask them what the next verse is, and that usually just completely dispels the argument. They just usually don't even know the next verse.
Right.
And the next verse contextualize and you realize, it's obviously not talking about that.
Right. So very, very important the context in that particular situation. Again, this is the Ari Lewis Show here on Israel Sports and News Radio. Also, the Nation of Israel YouTube page. My guest is Nachliel Selavan. He is the museum guy, so check him out on themuseumguy.co.il. We were talking about that there's a misnomer of...
we keep getting the website wrong, but we're going to have the information in the description. That's fine.
Oh, okay.
No, it's Museum Tour COAL. It's fine. It's good. It's all good.
We'll edit this out.
It's all good.
Okay, so let's talk about how there is a misnomer regarding places or people that are buried and it's incorrect. So, for example, we brought up King David. How did that happen where they got that wrong? Where this tradition, people go there Shavuot. I've been there in Shavuot, very intense experience. But if it's not the place, well, how did that happen?
Well, the question is how do we identify ancient places and ancient sites? It's usually there's some sort of urban tradition. I can say when it comes to identifying biblical sites in the land of Israel, we have something which is short of a miracle, which is the fact that the Arab names preserve the name of the biblical place. So or even later, like Batir is Beitar, right? You have Bitin is maybe Beit El. Like you have these names, which 9 out of 10 are pretty reliable. So and that's unique. You won't find that in Mesopotamia. You don't find that in ancient Egypt. You don't find that in Greece. You don't know what the actual city is based on what it's called now. There's no connection, So when it comes to sites in Israel, you have that tradition by people who've been there for many years. When it comes to this particular site, we don't really know where Binyamin of Tudela came up with that. All we know is that it was apparently an important burial at the time, and there must have been some local legend. We don't really know. So I don't really have a good answer for you, unfortunately.
There's somebody there, though.
There is some kind of...
Is there a theory it's one of the Crusaders?
I don't know about this one,
okay.
But about several, even Talmudic figures, which are much later, or Mishnaic figures, right? Which like Rabbi Akiva, you have Baba Ben Buta, you have Rabbi Meir Balanes, like all these different people. Some of them are arguably a sheikh of some sort. So we don't know.
Okay.
Maybe they are, maybe they're not. I will say that I heard from a Kabbalist rabbi that there is value to the gathering and praying to a tzaddik, even if the place itself,
praying to the tzaddik
even if it's Idub thee.
Right, but praying to the tzaddik spot.
Right.
Not to the
but even if it's not, of course, even if it's not the right one, the fact that people are praying to, because we don't want an icon and an image. We are iconoclasts from our very inception. We're iconoclasts. So the fact that it's maybe the tombs of the house of David, it's good enough. Okay. Whether people are praying, for the merit of David, King David, it doesn't really matter.
Because obviously, you've been to the Kotel several times, and myself as well, et cetera. There's just a certain energy as soon as you're there. And partly because thousands of years, Jews have been praying, focusing, thinking, and there's something to that. But let's get more detail of the Kotel, because again, I think there's some misnomers. The Kotel is the outer wall of the second temple that Herod built. Correct? So its importance is based on because it's the last thing we have of the second temple? Is that what you would say?
It's the closest you can get, one of the closest points, there's different parts of the wall, without ascending the mountain, which is generally something controversial. It's becoming now, there's much more of a movement to going to the Temple Mount. There are many who say that's okay. There are many who say you shouldn't, for various reasons. It can be for ritual purity reasons. It can be for political reasons. It can be for saying, this isn't where we're supposed to be focusing right now. There's other problems that we need to focus on. There's a range of approaches as to why yes and why no. But they say, Me'olam lo zaz hashchina me'kotel ha'ma'aravi. It's a famous saying. I don't know who said it. Where the divine presence never was removed from the western wall, but there's also the eastern wall and the northern wall and the southern wall. So there's other parts. Again, those are walls which are the outer wall of the Temple Mount complex, which was incredibly enlarged, augmented by King Herod the Great, even though it used to be just a smaller mountain, just Mount Moriah, Mount Zion. It was much smaller. So that's what it is.
So we spoke a lot about Judaism and a little bit of Christianity. Let's speak a little bit about Islam and sticking with the Kotel, because obviously there's the Golden Dome, and then the right to is the Silver Dome, and I think there's some confusion of the origin of those places. So if you can describe to us, because it's my understanding that the Silver Dome was made because some people accused a certain gentleman of being Jewish, and he said, no, I'm not. And then he wanted to bow against the Golden Dome, if you mean, his rear end, and point the other way. Tell us if that's...
Are we talking about Omar ibn Khattab?
Yes.
Wow, you're catching me unprepared about this stuff.
Well, just tell us what you've heard about it, at least the origins of the building of the Gold Dome and the Silver Dome.
I don't know too much about that.
Okay.
I really don't know too much about that, even though I did grow up there. Okay. But I don't know exactly, when it was built. I think it's Umayyad who built the Golden Dome, but I don't know for sure. So It's not my expertise. I do know that when Omar ibn Khattab came to Israel, to Jerusalem, and allowing Jews in and all that stuff, he was very sensitive to the fact that this is a holy Jewish place, and he was very sensitive to the fact that the Holy Sepulchre was a holy Christian place, which is why he didn't step foot in there, because he knew that had he stepped foot in there, it would de facto become holy to Islam. So he had the Mosque of Omar across the plaza from there to respect that. So we know that about him, so it does fit with the character.
Okay. But how about the aspect that, I don't know if people wear this, but a lot of people, I would say a lot of people that are in our holy books are also respected by Muslims. They look at our people's prophets. They look at Jesus' prophets.
They accept all the prophets. They just add on to them. They accept all the Jewish and the Christian prophets.
So has there been a change? For example, we believe in the Kedah Yitzchak, Rosh Hashanah's coming up, etc. That's what the shofar horn is based on. That Yitzchak was with Abraham, went up to the mountain, but they believe, my understanding, that Ishmael went up to the mountain. So again, are they basing that on a legend? When did that could change? I mean, tell us if you know the origin of that aspect.
Are you sure this isn't the nation of Ishmael? Wow.
We're trying to get more Arab fans of the program. Well, a lot of Arab haters.
There is a common denominator which has been pointed out in all of the miracles that show up in the New Testament are basically plagiarizing, recycling what happened in Tanakh. There pretty much isn't much new. I mean, I don't know, walking on water, whatever. There really isn't anything new. Because that's what gives it legitimacy.
Okay.
So you have, in the same way, I'm suggesting, because I know there's at least a couple different stories in Islam. They do it with the Akedah. They do it with Yitzchak and Ishmael. Like, they change those up. They're trying to lend legitimacy to the story by connecting it back to Judaism.
Okay.
So that's kind of what the idea is.
For example, and then let's say Christianity. Something might not like to say this, but are they taking the crucifixion story of the concept of a father sacrificing his son from a Kedah Yitzchak, which was a father about to sacrifice his son?
Wow, that's a tough question. That's a very deep theological question. I'm not equipped to make this comparison.
But there's a theory out there about it.
But the thing is, maybe, I don't know.
Because,
but it's very different, because the point of Akedat Yitzchak is really that he's not really supposed to sacrifice his son. It's a test for Avraham, and basically it's coming to teach him not to do human sacrifice.
Okay.
Right? So it's there using the conventions of the time, which are human sacrifice, telling him that's not okay. And there's something very deep going on there. Rabbi Sachs spoke about this in his famous debate with Richard Dawkins.
Right.
But when it comes to Christianity, I mean, it's a whole different concept of what you mean, like the Son of God. I mean, that whole thing, as far as the Jewish perspective is concerned, is really out of the window. So it's really hard to make a comparison.
Okay. The reason I bring this up, I was a religious studies major in college, and it was interesting to study the religions and the relationships, how a lot of times they connect. So, for example, Islam has several things in it that are similar to Jewish practice, like we pray 5 times Yom Kippur, and they
prayer,
pray 5 times a day.
fasting, Tzom, Salat. We have the Hajj. We have the going to the Aliyah Regel, so to speak, the pilgrimage. And tzedakah, right? The five, yeah.
Have you ever heard of theory that Muhammad had a Jewish influence? Apparently, grew up with Jews in Medina, things of that nature. It's a little bit confusing because the story from the Muslim perspective is that Muhammad is illiterate. So how do you write the Quran? They say they're going to say it's from the angel Gabriel, but as an historian, you have to say he didn't write it. Correct?
Pretty much. I mean, I don't want to get stoned for saying that, but I'm just saying, generally, very often you have oral traditions that were written down. But just to play devil's advocate here, we underestimate people's memory. We really underestimate people's memory. We say they didn't write things down, it was corrupted as it passed down. If you look just as recently as Yemenite Jews who came to Israel, they memorized thousands and thousands of texts because they rely on oral tradition. Oral tradition is very powerful. We have lost those faculties because we've relied on information being available at our fingertips.
Smartphone, yeah.
So you don't need to know anything, you just need to Google it.
Right.
People knew stuff. I mean, the ancient Greeks knew 1,200 words of a poem by heart. You have Socrates lamenting the fact that things will be written down because people will not know how to remember things anymore. So Plato, his student, wrote things down, but Socrates was like, I'll be damned if I write anything down.
Weren't we upset when the oral Torah got written down as well, right?
Yeah, we weren't. It was like, this is something that we're only doing in order to preserve it because we're seeing that people don't have the time to sit and learn and memorize because they're under persecution and hardships. So we need to write it down to preserve it, but it was written down in a way that it maintains its fluidity and openness to interpretation, which is part of the brilliance of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Judah the Prince, who codified it around the year 200, 218, 220. So when it comes to that, whatever it is you say about Muhammad, you can have something oral and then later on have someone else write it down. Right? That's plausible.
Okay.
In terms of his connection with Jews, I mean, he did try at first to proselytize the Jews, to bring them, and that when they refused, then he came out against them. And I believe that, I've never read the Quran myself, so I'm just saying this is what I've heard, that at the beginning he's very favorable towards the Jews,
Okay.
but then when they refused to accept Islam, then he was very vicious against them. He talks a lot about the golden calf, but there are a lot of good things about Jews. Jerusalem belongs to the Jews, they're the chosen nation, the people of the book also is a reference to the Jews from the Quran,
Right.
which I believe is a derogatory term at the time.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I
But
think.
now it sounds academic. Sounds pretty nice.
Yeah, the people of the book.
Right.
But it comes from the Quran, yeah.
Again, this is the Ari Lewis Show here on Israel Sports News Radio, and also the Nation of Israel YouTube page. Nachliel Selavan is our guest today.
I'm the museum guy, Museum Tour, COIL.
That's right.
Yeah.
Museumtour.co.il. So you mentioned Yemenite Jews because it's my understanding the Yemenite Jews arguably have the finest tradition, authenticity that they got from, meaning they kept it the best.
Right.
I don't know if that makes sense. But
Well, they've been isolated.
they've been isolated,
also.
so they're kind of forced. It was, they're saying necessity is the mother of invention.
Yeah.
So are those more authentic Jewish traditions? So, for example, us Ashkenazim here, we were influenced a bit by the Galut, influenced our practices.
Quite a bit.
So give us some examples of some of our practices that were influenced by some of our non-Jewish friends out there.
Practices.
I'll give you one we were talking about.
We do have a lot of prayers from, let's say, medieval times or Crusader period and so on, which are directly related to that. So, for example, the concept of what do we do on Yom Tov with the Askarat Neshamot? What is it called again? Yizkor.
Oh, yes.
Yizkor has to do with Yizkor was basically, people are not going to like to hear this, but Yizkor was basically a placebo for Jews who went through these hardships, gave them something emotionally to connect to, even though it's completely made up. In other words, there's no mechanism for this prayer to do what it does. It makes us feel good.
Okay.
You can say it works, it doesn't work. Right, it has a value,
Sure.
but that's, for example, something that's unique to the Jews. The Sephardim don't have that.
Sephardim don't have it, correct.
They don't have
They
that.
don't have it, yeah.
Right, and there's specific prayers that have to do with, like, I can't remember the exact example, but we say this in a particular way because we need to be able to say it quickly and run out just in case our shul is raided and burnt down. So we have to say this really quickly. And so, like, they change things, they make alternative things, they made things longer, they made things shorter. There's many examples like that where you see differences.
So, like, there's a section in RV, a long paragraph that used to be around because the people came late, they wanted to walk together, farming, etc.
Right, and they still say that in Chutz La'aretz, right? It's Havinenu or
Baruch
something.
Hashem, amen, amen.
Yeah, I mean, I lived in the States for a few years. I'm like, what is this thing?
Yeah, right.
Like, I've seen it in the Siddur, but I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting to be in Israel and see a Galut Siddur, and you're like, kind of things get mixed up a bit. But okay, so another example, we were talking about this in Shabbat at a shiur, is that Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, we have a tradition to bow all the way down.
Right.
And it's my understanding that we used to do this a lot, but then the Christians did it, and then somebody said, let's not look like the Christians. So are there times, for example, that we wanted to make a separation, and we didn't do certain things, even though we used to do them, to make sure, like, this is what the Jews do, and this is what the non-Jews do?
It's a good question. I've heard of things like this.
Okay.
You need more, like early modern experts to answer these questions. I just know that I have heard of such customs because there's a lot of stuff like that in Jewish tradition. Wow, I can't think of one.
Because that's an interesting way, because it's influence to not do something as opposed to influence to do something, which it troubled me a lot. I mean, if this is our tradition, then why don't we do it? We need just to do it.
Right.
But it kind of is what it is. I mean, I don't know.
Right.
Maybe we'll get back to that soon, this concept of bowing all the way down.
Cool, yeah.
When this bowing thing happened with these movements about a year ago, I was very troubled. There were firm Jews in New York doing it, that they would have this kneel thing.
I mean, the idea of the kneeling really has to do with the fact that there's certain things that you only do in the temple,
yes,
and you don't do them on the floor out of the temple because
right,
it does look like pagan worship, or maybe that's where you're talking about.
Yeah, I was bothered
right,
to see that. I'm not saying
right.
they were.
So we only do it, that once a year on Yom Kippur, or once on Rosh Hashanah. We don't really do it.
Right. I mean, at this point, we don't bow all the way down. There's the bowing in Aleinu and Shemona Esrei, etc., but not all the way down is only done on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur.
Right.
So there's an example. Let's talk another aspect with the Ashkenazi Jews and Yemenite Jews, as far as there's a little bit difference in the Torahs. It's a couple of letters.
Right.
It's a couple of letters, and then how do you reconcile that? Again, you have a kippah on your head, dati, you're religious.
Well, what's the real question? The authenticity of the Torah if there are changes?
Yes.
Well,
a couple letters,
the changes are very, very few.
Okay.
amount of errors that you have in the copying, even of Mishnaic texts, are much greater. You have, different manuscripts. I mean, there's actually the Yemenite manuscript of the Mishnah is slightly different than the one that we have. This was a famous question for another time. But it did come up, which version do you use to print a commentary on. But there's a lot more changes and scribal errors that are found in much later books than you find in the Torah. The Torah is much earlier, and yet you find so few that it's impossible.
Because there's millions and millions of Torah letters.
Right, and the thing is that we have very strict scribal rules to make sure that accuracy is maintained. So the fact that there's even 3 mistakes is it's impossible. That's it? Just 3, 4, 5 mistakes? Even if you'd have 20. Right now, the Talmud does talk about the fact that when we came back in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, Zerubbabel, etc., the Second Temple, we had there were a lot of gaps in our knowledge, and we used the manuscripts that we had, but there were some errors that happened, and so when Ezra Sofer came together and said, we're going to decide on this version, they kept certain markers like dots on top of a word in the text to say it's either this or that, and we're just letting you know that that's there. So we're aware of the fact that there's a conflict. So we're not claiming that it hasn't been corrupted at all, but we're saying that the corruption has been left to almost a miraculous minimum.
Right, well, for example, we have a custom, I think, Parsha Zachor, to pronounce a word 2 different ways.
Zecher Amalek.
Okay.
Right, but that's the meaning. Does it mean the memory of, or does it mean the males of?
Okay.
Zachar or Zikaron, Zecher. So that makes a huge difference, which is why some read both, to make sure that you have both meanings. Right, but that's unique. There's very few such things, like one letter here or there.
You said that there are some mistakes in the Mishnaic text, you said? Can you give us an example? Something really sticks out?
Off the top of my head, I don't remember the exact example, but the general idea is the Greek words in the Mishnah. There are Greek words in the Mishnah, and very often when somebody copied them hundreds of years later who didn't speak Greek, they're like, is that a nun? Is that a vav? I'm not sure. It looks like that. And they copied it that way because they didn't know what the actual Greek word was. And then comes somebody like Hanoch Albeck or other people who are scholars of the Mishnah, but they also know the Greek language, and they say, this is a dioston, a diopolis, a this or that. Like, this is obviously a scribal error from somebody who didn't know what the word meant, but they were really trying to copy it. So it's usually, it'll be in Greek words or words of languages. There's a lot of Greek words in the Talmud,
sometimes
in the Mishnah.
French words, does that also happen where they mistranslate a French word?
I don't know about the Rashi manuscripts.
But it is interesting, a lot of the big rabbis, obviously in the Galut, they weren't always writing in Hebrew. I mean, sometimes they wrote in their native language. It could be. I'm not aware of any specific examples. Okay.
But it could be. But you do find with, which one was it? I'm forgetting. There was something about copying the manuscripts where you have different versions. I'm trying to remember. But a lot of times when you have manuscripts, they just get damaged. So you just have to sort of figure out what it may have said.
Physically damaged.
Right, or they're just missing. Or sometimes you have differences which are, I may as well mention it because it's a fascinating topic.
Okay.
We have this medrash which is called Midrash Tanchuma. Midrash Tanchuma, people just look at the book today like, oh, here's a Medrash Tanchuma. It's basically a Medrash from the 1st century to the 6th century, sometimes even later, going parsha by parsha. But you have very different versions of it. And the reason for that is because the Medrash Tanchuma is more of a genre of exegetical study, which was developed in in Babylon, in Israel, and in France, or in Italy, and was independently written down. So some have, remnants of the older tradition, but they added onto it, and there are other traditions. So it's not that it's the same thing. There are 3 different things that were written down. That's a whole study. And I think, what's his name, Bergman wrote about it. I wrote a paper about it once. So it's like, there's certain things we just think like, oh, there's different versions. No, we misidentify it as one thing. There are 3 different texts which are related.
Okay.
So sometimes that's the issue.
Again, this is the Ari Lewis Show here on Israel Sports and News Radio, and also on YouTube. Hopefully, we'll see what happens. Nation of Israel YouTube page. Nachliel Selavan is our guest this evening. Let's talk about multiple wives, because a long time ago, we had multiple wives. It's in Tanakh. It's all over the place. And at some point, probably 1,000 years ago or so, Rabbi Gershon told the Ashkenazi, no, not happening. This is
not the Yemenites, though.
Correct. Not the Yemenites. And at some point, the Sephardim took on this tradition as well. Well, give us more. why did that happen? My understanding is that Rabbi Gershon said, people are looking at this kind of weird, this multiple wives thing, let's let it go. The Yemenites obviously didn't feel that way. I understand even 50, 100 years ago, they were still...
There still are.
Well, okay.
There still are.
Okay, well, there you go.
I mean, you have, as our tour guide in Jordan said back in the day, you need to have some serious income to support four wives. So,
I brought up this concept a couple years ago with a Sephardi guy. He said, this is going to be really controversial, but we'll say it. We obviously have a shidduch crisis right now. There's women that don't get married. Would it be so bad to go back to multiple wives? You have more people getting married, and then he said he paused like.
That's a very interesting solution. The question is, will you get yourself shot for suggesting it?
Yeah, that's why we're going to do it on YouTube here. I'm not doing it in an audience, but the Talmud talks about things like if you marry multiple wives, don't marry three. Be careful.
Or definitely don't marry sisters, but that's in the Torah.
The Torah. And then there's kind of, you could say there's hints that it wasn't such a good idea because look at the fights between Abraham's wives and Yaakov's wives.
Yeah.
But was the concept, let's say historically, Rabbi Gershon just said, this is kind of weird and we don't want to do this anymore. Was it a part of the system, the persecution? Was it a finance issue? The Jews had a lot of periods in history where they weren't making such good income and somebody couldn't afford multiple wives.
Well, I hope that the outcome of this isn't that you're expecting me to make a tour about all this stuff because this is like out there. I don't have a tour about that. Bring your wife on this tour. No, I'm just kidding. So, it's a great idea for a singles tour, the polygamy tour.
Right.
I'm not really sure which museum I should do this in.
That would be an awkward conversation to have with anybody, I think.
Yeah, I actually wrote a comedic ode called An Ode to Polygamy, which is really just a comedic commentary on the shidduch crisis.
Okay.
But anyway, I've used it at open mic events, which is why I have confidence to say it. I used to be embarrassed to even mention it. Okay. But anyway, so I'm not sure what the background of it, but today, I mean, you can understand that today it wouldn't fly just because of the way relationships work.
Yeah.
Financially, it also could have been an issue, but back in the day, having polygamy was a very good financial solution for women because of their social status at the time. I mean, today women can be making more money than men, so it's not really, you don't need that so much, right? So the whole institution of marriage has really changed. But back in the day, I mean, the fact that you're allowing polygamy, I believe, might be actually helpful to women. Because if, God forbid, their husband died or something like that, or disease or war or famine, pogroms or anything like that, and they have the option of several women marrying one man, and when there's more women than men, it's a great solution to help people. Whatever the background was for stopping that, I'm not really sure. That's a great question. But it definitely makes more sense financially today. That's for sure. To just support one.
To not have it, yes.
Yeah, I mean, imagine if you had to, I mean, God forbid, somebody gets divorced from 3 different wives. I mean, you're basically, you're not leaving the country.
Yeah, that would be a tough situation.
Yeah.
For example, there's a lot of cultures that have polygamy. Partly, I assume that if they're getting their people started, it is a way to mass produce human beings.
Right, which is one of the explanations for Yaakov marrying 2 sisters, even though that's considered to be prohibited.
Right.
You're not supposed to marry, according to the Torah, not to marry 2 sisters while they're alive.
Right, not even one time. And arguably, he even had 2 sets of sisters, right? There's Midrash, Bill, and Zilpah, etc.
Yeah.
But we know for sure Rachel and Leah, but part of the reason he did is because while they're starting a nation, they're going to have 12 kids. It's going to have 12 kids in one
desperate
woman.
Times.
Yeah, it was desperate times. He was on the run, etc. So more we're in a situation we're not in desperate times. So polygamy, you're not in favor of bringing it back, I assume.
No, I think that I mean, as the verse says, I think in Yeshayahu, but it's in the prophets, in Nekevat Sovev Gevel, there's this relationship between man and woman which is unique, which is singular. I think that is really the purest form. I mean, you see Adam and Chava, you see all the metaphors, God and the Jewish people, Shlomo HaMelech, the lover and the it seems that makes, even though Solomon was known for having many many concubines, but that idea of having one wife seems to be a lot more in tune with the core concept, even though there is a reality for the other things. It makes a lot of sense to me that needs to be the way things are. I mean, there's a lot of questions that I can't answer. The famous word question, if they say, in the future to come, in the, Tchiyat HaMetim, who's going to be the person who's going to be with you then, or in Olam Haba, which wife, if you, married 3? There's a lot of interesting questions out there.
Yeah, because they said, at the end of the day, Yaakov's original Bashert was Rachel, but it ended up being Leah. Right. And that's the way it worked out. Okay, again, this is the Ari Lewis Show here on Israel Sports News Radio. We talked about polygamy. Another controversial topic we were going to discuss more in detail, but I want to get your take on it, is the concept of Mazalot, zodiac signs, Kabbalah, things of that nature. I understand you have a different take on it, and you go ahead and present it.
Wow.
By the way, as an upfront thing, Svi and I probably disagree with you. We're very big into this kind of stuff. I met with the Mikobal about a week and a half ago. But I recall that we were at a dinner and you mentioned that you're not so sure if it's so accurate. So I'm going to allow you to present your case.
Well, I generally hold, as Maimonides does, that all of these things, astrology and the such, while they do have some sort of circumstantial success, they aren't reliable in a systematic way. Which is why generally the Rambam's approach, I'm going to give the big picture, then I'll go into some details. Generally, the Rambam's approach is that anything which isn't reliable systematically across the board is not worth your time, even though it's really cute, it worked here. He's not denying psychic phenomena, he's not denying supernatural, he just says it's a waste of time, which is very famously misunderstood by, the Gra himself, reads the Rambam in a way which makes the Rambam look like he's denying the validity, the existence of witchcraft, for example, which the Rambam himself in the halacha before the one which is criticized says that it does exist. And this is the verdict if a person actually does it. So he's acknowledging it exists, but he's saying that it's not worth your time it's not worth investing your time in it because you need to look for something that's systematic, that works. So that's generally my approach. I tend to see myself a little bit more as a rationalist, even though, as Svi will agree, there's so much in Judaism which no matter what you say is heebie-jeebie, right? But I'm more of a rationalist in the heebie-jeebifying of things. That being said, we do find the zodiac show up in text, in the liturgy, what's known as piyutim, and in the synagogue art of the 4th, 5th, 6th century and up. So famously in the zodiac of Beit Alpha, which is one of the more famous ones. But there's over a dozen synagogues in the Galilee in which you find, in the Golan Heights in the Galilee, where you find at the centerpiece of the synagogue is the zodiac with the names of the seasons as well, impersonated in typical Roman fashion. So you'll have the seasons themselves as a person, which is a very Roman practice, right? You have the Romans, it's clearly pagan. You have the Roman pictures of the Nile as a person, as a mermaid, right? Which is in a Jewish house from Beit Shan, which is an entrance to the Israel Museum's archaeological gallery. So it's undeniable that it's been part of the synagogues, and it's also part of the piyutim themselves, where they say, we read Tfilat Geshem or Tfilat Tal, when you have the special prayers when we switch over for praying for rain or for the summer mode, there's prayers that very ancient prayers, contemporary of those synagogues. So you can imagine, there's the pictures on the floor, here's what they're saying, and they complement each other. So there definitely was a belief in that at the time. The question is, okay, so what? So they believed in that at the time. Is that saying that those zodiac signs really impact our lives based on when we were born, or is it basically saying okay, there is some sort of force of nature which we're using in an allegorical sense? Is it just liturgical? Who knows? I don't really know where to go with that, but I'll give you an example that's a little more distance from us, so we can look at that in a more sobering way. Zechariah. Zechariah has a very famous, iconic image, which is the vision of the menorah, in a vision in which this angel talks to him in his dream, and he says, "What do you see?" And he says, "I see this menorah with 2 olive trees pumping oil into it, and that 2 olive branches on the side of the menorah became the symbol of the state of Israel based on that vision." It's the first time that the menorah is expressed in the Tanakh as a symbol of hope, as opposed to another one of many temple vessels, right? Which is unique. It's the first time it shows up as a symbol, as opposed to just another vessel. So that's unique. And over there it mentioned that there's this stone on top of the menorah which has 7 eyes, and those are Einei Hashem HaMeshotetot B'chol Haaretz. Those are the eyes of God which are looking at you throughout the universe. Now, what is that a reference to? Back at that time, people believed that the solar system had 7 planets, which were observable, and those 7 planets are the eyes of God looking at the world. Now, today, we know that that's factually untrue, right? But the prophet is using the world of references that he knows to convey a real message. So that's a lot easier to relate to today than the zodiac, because we still talk about it today, and we're like, oh, even though if you really look at it, the zodiac really comes from the Babylonian calendar, which has 16, I think, and not 12 symbols, and the time of the year doesn't really align to the sign anymore. They're out of sync. So just from that perspective, from a rationalist approach, I say it doesn't work, right? So,
well, we do say that the Chagim have energies to it.
Chagim, yes.
Okay. And then the Chagim, though, they're would theoretically, they're moving based on the calendar and the leap year going by the moon, but meaning to say that that is made by Hillel. I mean, Hillel set the calendar. So it's not necessarily, you know what I'm saying? It's not exactly in line with the moon.
Well, Shmuel Katan, I think, but when they set the calendar, they also obviously we have a complex system because we also have the solar calendar,
Yes.
and that nuanced way of combining the sun and the moon is considered to be something unique.
Right.
Because the Christians, the ancient Egyptians had a calendar which is completely solar, right? Which is why they had 10 days a week, 3 weeks a month, and they ended up having 360 days. Those extra 5 days have to do with the 5 children of Ra, which they sort of fill in to make 365, because it doesn't work.
Okay.
And then you have the Muslim lunar calendar, which means that let's say, Ramadan shows up every 27 or 29 years at the same time of year, or something like that. Maybe I'm getting the numbers wrong. But basically, it's out of sync. So we have this correcting system of making it work. And one of the calculations is making sure that Pesach shows up Chag HaAviv. In other words, you need to, Pesach, Nisan, as in Mesopotamia, is the first month of the year. Nisanu is the Babylonian name of Chodesh HaRishon, the first month. And that's why when you see that it's still winter, then in Adar, which is month number 12, you just split the month into 2. I mean, you double it. That's called a full year, Shana Me'uberet.
Like coming up.
Yeah, Adar Aleph, Adar Bet. You add another month to give it a buffer so that the springtime is always Pesach, because it needs to be Chag HaAviv. So in that sense, we do have that checks and balances to make sure that the holidays are related to the time of year. The spring itself is the holiday of freedom, and freedom and spring are intertwined psychologically. I mean, it makes sense. And it's also very much tied to the land of Israel, because it's not the same thing in Finland, right?
Right.
So it's supposed to be here.
You mentioned Nisan being a Babylonian name, and I want to ask you that aspect because Tammuz obviously is not such a Jewish name.
No, it's a pagan name.
So why would Jews name a month after a pagan thing?
One of many things that we have, right? I mean, the fact that we have Aramaic as the language of the Talmud, right? Or the fact that we have Greek in the Mishnah and so on. But we basically have adopted things in Babylon, and which we kept with us, the Talmud says, and the Mishnah says too, in order to remember where we came from. Our connection to Babylon is deeper than the Babylonian exile, because Avram comes from Mesopotamia, and we need to remember that. And the fact that we've been to Babylon, the Medrash actually says, is to remind you that you have unresolved issues that have to do with where you come from, and you need to deal with them. You think Babylon's over, and you're here in Israel, and it's not. There's things you need to deal with. So Babylon is a major part of that. You can say philosophically, but also in the temple we had the Eastern Gate was called, as the Mishnah says, Shar Shushan, the Shushan Gate, which had an image of the capital of the Persian Empire on top of the gate, the primary gate to the entrance of the temple in the east. The Eastern Gate, like, why would you do that? To remember where we came from. So we do have a lot of those things where you'd say, like, isn't the Jewish name, the Hebrew name more important? You'd say, like, but actually the narrative, the story has a lot more meaning to us, where we came from, what we went through, and remember that we came from Babylon. So there is an aspect of that, of remembering where we came from, even though it's clearly, I mean, the Tammuz is an actual deity.
Right. Because apparently Saddam Hussein actually had a missile called Tammuz, I think.
Did he?
So, yes. So he, sometimes our enemies know our books better than some Jews out there. It's pretty interesting.
I mean, he did see himself as a reincarnation of Sancherib, Nebuchadnezzar. He made coins. He rebuilt the Ishtar Gate. He's on his bills. He built this palace there. I mean, some serious stuff.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. This is also kind of random, but I'll bring this up. Adolf Eichmann also studied the Talmud and was fluent in Ivrit, was in Jerusalem in 1938.
What?
There's some weird stuff with our enemies, man. I don't know where it all comes from, but
wow.
Anyways, this is the Ari Lewis Show here on Israel Sports News Radio and also the Nation of Israel YouTube page. We're with Nachliel, the museum guy. Last question I want to ask you. I think you'll find this pretty interesting. I understand. I'm going to give a shout out to one of my archaeologist friends, David Gelman. We had a long conversation. Oh. You know David, right?
Rings a bell.
Yeah. So great guy. We talked about a year and a half ago. I said, it's my understanding that there was some point in time where Jews believed that God had a wife. And he said, yes. There was a period of time where Jews believed that. Obviously, I'm not saying that's true. Any comments on that? Any evidence you've seen? Any of that? And then my shout out to Lori Lai, who said, because I brought this up to her, and she said that's part of the reason we have this, we call it Shechina, to try to represent that aspect, and Shabbat queen and things of that nature. But if you're into this concept about God having a wife, and the Jews believe that.
So, okay. This is really taking me to what I do in the museum. Okay. There is a section in the Israel Museum which is dedicated to Hebrew texts and to writing and scribal practices. And they have a very famous piece from the Sinai called, a place called Kuntilat Ajrud, which is just the name of the place, the Arabic name of the place, where they found a text which says, La Hashem, to God, Yud Kei Vav Kei, Vila Asherato, and to his Asherah. Asherah is Ashtarta Asherah. The word star comes from Ashtara, Ashtoret Asherah. It's the female goddess in the Canaanite pantheon. Many parallels in Mesopotamian worships and mythology. So we do find pagan worships throughout the land, but this is where we have a significant chasm between the Jewish traditional view, which is plausible, right, and the academic view, which has its own internal logic and can also be plausible. So the question is, what are you sticking with? But the two are very different. And to do that, I'm going to give a very poignant example, then I'll talk about the details. So the poignant example is Yoshiyahu, King Yoshiyahu Josiah. In Jewish circles, we look at Yoshiyahu as the last of the great kings of Judah. He's 5 kings before the end. He was killed by Paro Necho, who was on his way through Israel's coast, on the way to today's border of Turkey, Syria, known as Karkemish, which is the battle where the Assyrian Empire suffered its ultimate defeat against the rising Babylon. So he's coming to aid Assyria against Babylon. And on the way there, Yoshiyahu blocks him and says, "You shall not pass." And the reason he blocked him is because, and this is the Jewish traditional view, but it's also based on some of the actual sources. The question is, what are they referring to? Because some of the stuff we fill in the gaps. So basically, Yirmiyahu Hanavi, the prophet Jeremiah, tells him, you should not get involved in foreign affairs. Let Paro Necho go about his business. Don't get involved. And what he does is he's convinced that because he was able to institute this revolution, you can say, of restoring, and that's the key word, restoration of monotheism and getting rid of all this pagan influence, because he had the power. Assyria is in fact declined, Egypt was weak, and we had this freedom, what Professor Oded Lifshitz of Tel Aviv University calls a power vacuum. And because of that power vacuum, he had the autonomy to reinstitute the Jewish faith. And that is worshiping one God. Even though there was plenty of pagan worship throughout the land, we have plenty of proof of that, both in archaeological finds and the prophets constantly talking about it, right? So it's not a surprise, right? What you find is that he was convinced that because he thought he was successful, that he has the moral high ground, and therefore the blessings in Deuteronomy and Devarim, v'cherev lo ta'avor ba'artzachem, even at times of peace. A sword won't even just pass through your country. Just passing through. Not going to fight you, no business with you. We're just passing through that massive bridge between the 3 continents. We're just passing through, right? He said, that blessing needs to come true because we have the moral high ground. And he was wrong, and that's ba'avon litzanei ador, Chazal say. It's the cynics of the generation which fooled him and pulled the wool over his eyes. So he didn't know that they found mechanisms for worshiping Avodah Zarah which his scouts couldn't figure out, his KGB weren't able to discover. So that being said, he was wrong about assessing the situation. So he was killed. What exactly was he trying to do? In the Jewish tradition, he was performing a religious revolution of restoring things to the way they needed to be. The academic view is not restoration, but reformation. He is inventing something which never existed before, completely made up, because he had the power to do so. Because Assyria is declining and he's in a power vacuum, right? Egypt's declining. So he's inventing something, and based on what he's inventing, he goes and writes this book called Deuteronomy, and that's called the Deuteronomistic part of etc. It's basically saying we're taking these ideas of God is one and don't worry, all the stuff that we take for granted that's in the Shema, right? Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. That's all in Deuteronomy. And he's saying that was written later to reconcile the other Torah retroactively with his invention, which you can say started with Hezekiah, right, who really had a little bit of autonomy. The Sancherib, king of Assyria, didn't manage to capture Jerusalem, even though he almost destroyed the kingdom. So that's the academic view. The question is, where are you coming from? Because both can be reconciled and deal with the evidence. On the one hand, you can say, here's the proof. We find many examples like Kuntilat Ajrud, where you have Jews clearly with Jewish names in Hebrew writing to Yud Kei Vav Kei, to the God, the theophoric name. The tetra
Tetragram.
Thank you. Tetragram. I think that's a longer word for it, but just call it tetragram, and connecting that with Asherah, and like the prophet, and you can say like, well, the prophets are saying you're doing that, don't do it.
Right.
Right. But you have, for example, one of these examples, which are classic examples brought in academia, where it mentions in the end of Book of Kings, where Isaiah's one of the things he's doing is getting rid of all of these people who are worshiping Malchut HaShamayim, the kingdoms of the heavens. But the academic view will say it's actually Malkat HaShamayim, those worshiping the queen of the heavens. So that's part of what the scholar you're talking about is referring to. It's very famous amongst in scholarship circles. Usually religious Jews, unless they're academic, don't even know of the fact that exists. Like they'll read all the passages about Nachash Bariach HaKalaton, the massive Leviathan and the great serpent which God's going to fight in the oceans, which is clearly coming out of Babylonian myths, Ugaritic texts, and they don't even notice it's there because it's so watered down and explained in a completely different way, which to the people in the time was like, oh, obviously he's taking that and recontextualizing it to mean something else. Huh. Right? So we have a lot of things which you can basically argue one way or another, and I like the conversation, right, even though obviously I'm coming for the traditional approach, saying, well, yeah, the prophets are talking about this is not okay. The question is, do you have any proof of monotheism before Chizkiyahu, before Yeshayahu? That's a hard argument to make, because we don't have any remnants of the first temple, it was destroyed. We don't have any remnants of the Mishkan, it was destroyed. Like, what are you expecting to find? Like, you don't make statues of God, so you're not going to find any. But people who are worshiping idolatry are going to make idolatries. You're going to find that. So if you're not supposed to make anything, what are you expecting to find? So again, we have a lot of oral tradition and texts, which you can then argue who wrote them, when were they written, how were they edited, and that's where there's a lot of an argument about the traditional versus the academic approaches.
All right, fascinating discussion. Nachliel, the museum guy. This has been the Ari Lewis Show here on the Nation of Israel YouTube channel. I know you're lecturing in a couple hours. People will see this after your lecture, so give us a plug. I understand on Tuesday you're going to be giving a tour. Tell us
in the Israel Museum.
Yes.
So I've been doing museum tours around the world for the past 5 years. Especially with Corona, I have virtual access, so I can reach communities around the world and take you to museums around the world, which is fascinating.
Actually helped your business, right?
Incredibly. Like, I mean, I know that tour guides were struggling to make a living because there's no tourism. Because I had all these people I worked with, and I knew that people are looking for virtual content, somehow they like, here, there's this guy with this virtual museum tours, and that started leading, one thing led to another. So I've done a lot of very interesting work there, and now I'm back to the museum. So in the Israel Museum, I'll give some background and then talk about the specific tour I'm doing this Tuesday, and really every Tuesday of the summer till the end of August, and other days as well. The Israel Museum is unique. It has the cream of the crop, the best discoveries in the land of Israel. Even in the Museum of the Philistine Culture in Ashdod, there are some of the crown jewels, you can say, of those discoveries from the Philistine sites, which are actually in the Israel Museum. And in the Philistine Museum itself, there's just a replica of it telling you the originals in the Israel Museum. Because Teddy Kollek's vision of the museum when he built it in the 1960s was, we're going to have a world-class museum, and you have the finest discoveries from the land of Israel. So that being said, when you go to a museum anywhere else, like I started at the Metropolitan Museum, it's a novelty to suggest a Jewish-themed tour, a Tanakh tour. Even though there are plenty of Christian groups who do biblical tours in museums there. In the British Museum, there's traveling the British Museum with the Bible. Like, there's all these booklets, right? But it's more of a novelty. It's not, you don't expect it. When you come to the Israel Museum, that's your starting point. Except that it's very academic, so if you have a sensitivity to Jewish tradition, you might want to say, I don't really know if I want to go there. I want to shield my children from seeing that, or I don't know how to deal with it. You go there and you find, the 8th century BCE, and it's talking about the invention of monotheism. Like, I don't want to read this. Like, what is this doing here? So my specialty is knowing how to work with different Jewish denominations and communities and to create conversation in the museum about those things, and to know how to deal with this. I have very religious people from Lakewood to the Israel Museum and the Beis Yaakov, yeshivas, you name it. So I know how to work with these people who have sensitivities. It's very important. My current tour, which I'm doing this Tuesday, and every Tuesday pretty much till the end of the summer, is called What Was Herzl's Favorite Emoji? Which is it's a sexy name, it's a catchy name, it's to get your attention. But it's really talking about the development of icons and symbols, and not necessarily only the menorah, but the menorah is a key part of the conversation because it's the most famous Jewish symbol for the past 2,000 years. And it's changed over time. In the earliest picture of it that we found in archaeology, there's only two from the time when the temple stood, and that is an etching on the wall of a priestly house, the Herodian Quarter, which is also a museum in the Jewish Quarter, but the original is in the Israel Museum. It's an etching of the menorah and the showbread table and the mizbeach, the two different altars. And then you have a coin of Matityahu Antigonos, which was made under siege when he was besieged by Herod the Great in Jerusalem. It's a limited edition coin. Only 60 of them were found in the world. It has the menorah that's used on the 10 agora coin, which is the smallest coin currency used today in circulation. So that's based on the last Hasmonean king. Those were made in the time the temple was there. It's not a symbol, it's not an icon, it's just something, like you can discuss what it means, but the temple was standing. But later on, in the 2nd, 3rd century, you find the menorah on Jewish catacombs in Bet Sharim, that is, which is where Yehuda Nasi was buried, right? You found the menorah painted on catacombs in the Via Torlona in Rome, right? They're painted on, the menorah becomes a symbol of this is something Jewish, as opposed to in the context of the cross, because we are in the land of Israel, and the Christianity is now becoming a nascent and powerful religion, which has the backing of an empire behind it, and we now need to define our identity. And finding an identity means you need a symbol. So that's the conversation I have in the museum, where we see Byzantine art, which is Mishnah and Talmud period, where you see several different Jewish icons. The menorah is one of them, which become very obviously and clearly in contrast with the cross, like one to one. Here's the exact same building, the exact same artifact, the exact same jewelry, the exact same everything. Here's a cross, here's a menorah. It's very obvious when you see it there in the museum. And then when we fast forward, we're talking about Jews in the diaspora and synagogues, and the curtains, the parachot of the Aron Kodesh, and Chanukiyot, and things. And we discuss what exactly do we need at this period of time, and why are we using these images on the Sifrei Torah, on the Aronot Kodesh, and all that stuff. And we finally move forward to the modern Zionist period, which is the movement from the 18th century, where we're saying we're a new movement. We want to detach ourselves from the downtrodden, exilic Jew, Tuvia the milkman from Fiddler on the Roof, and we want to celebrate Bar Kochva, or celebrate the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees, and to be the strong, powerful Jew. So Hanukkah suddenly becomes completely being invested with all these new songs, which are like Yemei Chanukah, all these modern songs, which are modern Zionist songs, or Bar Kochva, and these stories about Bar Kochva. And these coins of the Hasmoneans and the Great Revolt and Bar Kochva and the symbol of the menorah, which has to do with Hanukkah and the Maccabees, suddenly become reinvested with a new meaning, which become part of the very popular symbols of Zionism, which is intentionally not religious. And we today take that for granted with the symbol of the State of Israel and all kinds of other things. And then there's also the conversation about where the six-pointed star, the Magen David, comes from, and why the Zionist movement deliberately chose that and not the menorah ultimately for the flag of the State of Israel, there's also a very powerful agenda behind that. So that's the conversation we have. And so it's a 2-hour tour. We go through Second Temple and Roman Byzantine art, and then we go to Jewish art, like daily life in Judaism, religious art, Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, holidays, Hanukkah, Chanukiyot, and we end with the art from the Bezalel Art Academy, which has a lot to do with the making of the vessels in the Mishkan, and Tanakh stories, but reinvesting them with modern meaning. And there we have that conversation of, so what do we need today? What is the icon, the emoji, the symbol, the picture that carries meaning behind it, that speaks to us today? So that's a very relevant conversation to have. And I think it's a very versatile tour, which can really create very rich conversation.
All right. I never saw Fiddler on the Roof, but Tuvia is a great name. All right, you two. Let's see. We talked about Christianity, Islam, multiple wives. Does God have a wife? Adolf Eichmann, Saddam Hussein. But we didn't mention the vaccine. So upload this episode. This has been the Ari Lewis Show here on IsraelSportsNewsRadio.com. Also the Nation of Israel YouTube page. We'll see Nachliel, the museum guy. They want to find you. Where should they go? Well, you can Google the museum guy and you will find me. Nachliel, the museum guy. I'm all over social media, just about every platform except Snapchat, because I don't believe in that. And I don't have the patience for it. And museumtours.co.il, that's my website. You can find me Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, whatever. And yeah, I'm advertising this tour every Tuesday till the end of the summer. And I have availability pretty much every day of the week that the museums are open. Just hit me up, reach out to me. I'm happy to work with you this summer, do any tour. There's so much to do in the Israel Museum. I hope everyone enjoyed this episode. God bless and good night. Good night.